Now, that's hit some companies hard. It was actually some companies benefited from it. Those second and third tier players did very well. In education and healthcare, I think the main message they learned from that is, yes, you can try and stop in the education, for example, you can try and stop this tutoring in core classes because only the relatively wealthy can afford these online schools. But if you get rid of the online schools, then each tutor can only reach an even smaller number of people. So what happened is the price of a private lesson just skyrocketed. And if you try and do the same in healthcare, it's if you try and cut down or improve access to the best therapies, the therapies that required a lot of innovation and research and development, these companies just say, well, if we can't at least earn some period of monopolistic profits, it's not worth our while investing. And that's why we in the West have a patent system. And it was really trying to achieve some of these things and making a few missteps that was the key behind the regulatory issues this year. Now, the Chinese have put their hands up and said, yeah, we made some mistakes here. And I think the real problem is not that the Chinese are anti-private enterprise. They're really not. They see the wealth it creates, but they don't have the kind of consultative system that we have here in the US. As soon as you say, I want to write this piece of legislation, then you have the companies, the lobbyists, the media are arguing the pros and cons of each side. You don't get that to anywhere near the same extent in China. They do need to build those processes. And until they do, I think they realize that they have to go a little bit lighter on the regulation, and they have to be a little bit more transparent about the details of what they'd like to do and give it a bit more of a time lag before you implement the policies.
If you were to rank the issues that critics of China bring up, and I've just mentioned several of them. I mean, I didn't even begin to mention the geopolitical issues of expansion in the South China Seas and the aggressive posturing, vis-a-vis Taiwan. How do you rank them, and how do you assess them as far as the investment opportunities or risks that China offers?
Well, I'd start with the geopolitical issues and say that these are the ones that we think have the least probability of happening. So do we think China would invade Taiwan? I think it's highly unlikely. It would be very expensive militarily, very expensive in terms of internal prestige of the regime. But if it happens, it's a huge impact. And I think the same with the geopolitical issues. I mean, China, the rhetoric against the US is one thing, and both sides seem to be constantly having a go at each other. But in truth, China's stuck by the sanctions. So it seems to be more of a rhetorical fight than anything else.
And these are the sanctions against Russia you're talking about.
Yes. So that falls into the same category of these. It doesn't seem likely that they'll break those sanctions. If they do, then obviously it would have a massive impact, particularly on exporters, but any businesses trying to get into the Chinese market. The delisting issues, that's an interesting one. It really, in the very long run, doesn't matter if these companies, at least from our point of view, whether they're listed in the US or in Hong Kong. And in fact, for some of these companies, these sort of bellwethers of the Chinese tech industry, the Chinese aren't able to own them because they're either listed in Hong Kong or the US. So if they delisted from the US and you opened up access to domestic Chinese investors to invest in them, I think they would be heavily favored by the Chinese investor. So that's one where I think it's just a waiting game for that to resolve itself. When it comes to the regulation, I think that is something which we're more actively engaged in thinking about. How do we navigate through this? And I think there's a couple of things you can do. First of all, if a company is in a monopolistic position, don't ascribe to it a monopolistic type valuation. Think about what sort of returns it would be generating in a competitive industry, and that's how you should value it.
Robert, when you're talking about some of the monopolistic industries, what can you give me some examples of that companies that might be interesting, or that you're watching to see how they do handle competition when it comes along?
In China, we do have a number two listed online platform, and it's done relatively well because the regulation was there to make sure that it can compete against Alibaba. And you see the same thing in some of the gaming industries as well. Now, because some of these giant monopolies, they got so big and they got so much cash, they started to move into all sorts of other businesses, and they got a little bit
Hmm.
unfocused. Whereas these second tier players have remained very focused, true to what they do, and tend to be quite nimble, and tend to be pretty good users of capital because of it. So that's been one area that we've been focused on.
Barron's recently did an article that it was Alibaba is now popular among bargain hunters, and my question to you is, should it be?
I would broaden it out actually beyond Alibaba and say that
Uh
there's a
huh.
lot of value in Chinese equities at the moment. If you think what
Okay.
they've been hit with regulatory issues, they've been hit with zero COVID, they've been hit with poor sentiment in terms of the geopolitical issues. And on top of that, it's been the one place in the world where money and fiscal policy has been pretty tight. Core inflation in China is less than 1% at the moment. In the US, they're raising rates. In the West, they're raising rates. In part of Asia, they are too. I think in China, they'll have a moderately loose stance. Monetary conditions are getting slightly looser at the moment. Fiscal policy is getting a little bit looser at the moment. And so when you stack all of these things up, that's typically when markets valuations are underappreciated and on the low side.
Is there a way to invest in Asia and minimize our risk, our China
Sure,
risk? How do we do that?
there are all sorts of ways you can do it.